So in this session we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel and the site, the city where it's located, and try to pinpoint that. Essentially, this is the second part of a first part presented earlier in the conference, where I tried to demonstrate that we can identify the outward movement of people from the site at Babel, according to Genesis 11, where some large number of people had gathered and attempted to build a tower in the first real urbanized setting in the ancient world, and they ran into their own pride, and that led to the confusion of language and thus the outward expansion of these people. And I tried to connect that movement to one of the two prehistorical expansions of people outward from Mesopotamia before the advent of writing, which kicks off the historical period. And through comparing and contrasting, I tried to demonstrate that the Uruk expansion, as so-called in Mesopotamian archaeology, is equal to what we can call the post-Babel dispersion people. And that the other movement, which was earlier than the Uruk expansion, the Ubaid expansion, doesn't match what we'd expect to see at the moment when their languages were confused and they couldn't speak to each other. So if you're interested in following that argumentation, you can get the DVD or talk to somebody who was there. If not, grab me when you have a free moment and pin me down and make me take you through that presentation. Which of course I do. I mean, that's what I love. So let's look together at ancient Babel and both the site and the tower and see if we can identify them. In 1587, there was a painting made by an unknown Flemish painter, and he drew the Tower of Babel according to his perception of what it would have looked like. And you can see that he drew a circle at the base and a smaller circle above, and then a series of circles as they go up. And probably this reflects what they're used to seeing architecturally with large buildings. So they drew the building according to how they expected it to look, based on their own culture. Of course, as we hopefully know today, the problem with understanding the ancient world well is our own world and interpreting the ancient world through the lenses of our present world. And the more we can strip that away, the better we have a chance at understanding things the way they are. So hopefully we'll be able to see how the Tower of Babel indeed may have looked. Let's start with the biblical background, Genesis 11, 1 through 2, and then verse 2. This is my translation, so any disagreement you have with it, you can take it up with me rather than any distant committee. And it says this: "Now all the earth had one language, and the words were common ones. So it came to pass with their moving from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar," and we would associate that with the Akkadian word Shumer, which in English today we call Sumer, or southern Mesopotamia. "And they settled there. Then they said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower.'" And the word in Hebrew could mean tower or large edifice, and it could mean platform. It's pretty diverse in its range of meaning. "With its top in the sky. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the surface of the entire earth." Well, my historical observation is this: during the time when all mankind on the surface of the earth conversed with a single universal language, and that reflects the first sentence above in the text, "Now all the earth had one language, and the words were common ones." That's the introduction the author Moses is giving to his readers to set the context. He wants you to know that's a period of time when everybody spoke the same language. And as I argued in the previous presentation, it's a misconception of ours to think that the biblical text is saying all of the people who are existing on the earth went to one place and lived there. The Bible never says that. That's in our conceptions. And that's a wrong conception we read into the text and then perpetuate through Sunday school teaching. They spoke with a single universal language. Some undefined number of them moved westward and settled on a plain that was in the land of Shinar, known as Sumer today. They built a city to sustain themselves, and their pride in their own achievements caused them to fear the possibility of being scattered over the surface of the whole earth. They figured that if they built structures that would make them renowned or famous, this would keep their populace from leaving the city. The question to solve is the location of the city and the tower that they built. So first of all, we begin with a problem. Isn't it always fun to begin with a problem? And that problem is whether or not the site we know as Babylon is actually the same Babylon as the Babel of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. I think I would agree with you, and we'd agree with everyone else, that the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's day in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, roughly the 600s, the 500s BC, that Babylon is in central Mesopotamia, and we can all agree that it's the site that everybody concludes is Babylon. But what about the Babel of Genesis 11? So I think there's a huge historical problem with the site of Babylon being connected with the Babel of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. So the red arrow is pointing to the red dot, which is where Babylon is located. You can see it there, just south of where the Euphrates and Tigris come closest together before they ultimately converge, just northwest of the Persian Gulf's banks. Well, the Neo-Babylonian Empire featured a very important city, the largest city of its day, the most important city in the ancient world at the time, and that's the city of Babylon. That's the Rome of its day, the London of its day, if you want to talk about the British Empire. Basically, all roads led to Babylon. And Babylon was built on two sides of the Euphrates River at this time. And toward the middle of the city, there was a building that was constructed called Etemenanki. And Etemenanki is a ziggurat. It's a later ziggurat. It's not one of the earliest ones in existence. But it's one of the most impressive in history. So secular scholars today often, especially those who date the biblical events, earlier biblical history, at a much later date, they would say to you, well, when the Tower of Babel is spoken about in the Bible, all that's being talked about is this 6th century BC structure in the middle of Babylon. But we would have a problem with that. And this is an artist's rendition of probably what that structure looked like. You can see that it's much more squared than circular, and you can see there are 4 basic sides and ramps, one or more ramps, leading up to the upper stories of this building. It's an extremely large and intimidating building, to be sure, and it's connected with the cultic activity that took place in Babylon. So what's the problem with locating Babel at Babylon? Well, there were only 2 cultural mass dispersions from Mesopotamia during the prehistorical period, but the origin of both of them was southern Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf, not central Mesopotamia of Babylon's location. That's a big problem. Different places and different time periods. The 2 outward expansions that I talked about in the previous presentation took place before writing began. And of course, Babylon, you're going to see, existed in a later period. So number 2, the Uruk period experienced remarkable changes in southern Mesopotamia, exceeding any expectations that might have existed from the achievements of the Ubaid period, which immediately preceded it. So the Uruk is a period in Mesopotamian archaeological periodization. The Ubaid period is before it, and it was during those 2 periods that we have these outward expansions of people from southern Mesopotamia. Here's a quote from Michael Rofe. He says, "These innovations, which occurred in the Uruk and Jemdet Nasr periods," and the Jemdet Nasr is immediately after the Uruk period, constituted what has been called the urban revolution. This includes sites such as Uruk, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash, also known as Girsu. Thus, the launching of urbanism occurred in southern Mesopotamia, and the timing was the Uruk period, which I tried to convince you in the previous presentation that is that the Uruk period, the late Uruk period, is when the expansion took place that we can connect very, not only plausibly, but confidently as the post-Babel dispersion. So the Jemdet Nasr period, which followed the Uruk period, that is when we have the official advent of writing. The period before that, the late Uruk period, is called the Proto-Literate period in many of, especially the older scholarly works. So if you read about the Proto-Literate period, that is the Uruk period, which is when, let's say, writing was just about ready to blossom. And all of this began, and you can read about it in my book, which I'm going to talk about on Thursday at my presentation. All of this began with I lost my train of thought. All this began with the, I'll come back to it. Okay, so 3. Surface surveys at Babylon produced no ceramic or artifactual evidence to suggest that this city was even occupied during the Uruk period. That is, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's day was not even in existence during the Uruk period, according to the record of the pottery that has been found in surface surveys, as archaeologists would scour the site, pick up pottery, and that which is datable, it doesn't go back far enough in history to even be connected to the Uruk period. The problem of an extremely high water table at Babylon, admittedly, prohibits archaeologists from studying occupational levels there that are under and predate the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, yet surface surveys should produce pottery of every occupational phase, even if some of the earlier periods are under the water table, because the pottery always finds its way to the surface of every period where it's occupied. That's how archaeology works. Historical sources suggest that Babylon began as a small town that sprang up only during the Jemdet Nasr period. And in that period, immediately after the period of the Uruk expansion, it was just a small town. It was a little community. Only centuries later was it built up into a great city. So that shows us there is a huge problem to suggest that the Babylon we know of as Babylon was equal to the Babel of Genesis 11. Well, thankfully, there are multiple uses of the Babylon toponym. So we're going to look at epigraphical Mesopotamian texts that refer to many or numerous Babylons. If all of the evidence from antiquity militates against associating Babel of Genesis 11 with the traditional site of Babylon, the first question that must be asked is whether other Mesopotamian sites, particularly in southern Mesopotamia, were referred to in the literature, the ancient literature, as Babel or Babylon in ancient times. If so, perhaps one of them is a better candidate for the Babel of Genesis 11. In fact, there is quite a varying range of evidence indicating that the designation Babylon deliberately was given to other cities in Babylonia throughout antiquity. So we do have examples. What we need to do is scrutinize them to see if they fit the period of the post-Babel dispersion that we're associated with the late Uruk expansion. The following sites are examples of ancient Near Eastern cities that were referred to as Babylon in one or more ancient Near Eastern historical source. Arbela, Ashur, Borsippa, Eridu, Kish, Kulab, Kuwara, and Kalhu, known in the Bible as Kala, and Nineveh. So those are our 9 sites that we're going to examine. Well, Kalhu, also known as Kala, Ashur, and Nineveh, as well as Arbela, are all located in northern Mesopotamia and or in ancient Assyria. Since this region is far from the source of the Uruk expansion, being located up mostly in northern Mesopotamia, these sites can be removed safely from contention as the Babel or Babylon that we're seeking after here. So automatically we have 4 sites because of geographical considerations that can be eliminated from possibilities. Even though they're called Babel or called Babylon in ancient inscriptions, they can't be our Babel, because our Babel had to be in southern Mesopotamia, very close to the Persian Gulf. Borsippa, located in the to the southwest of Babylon, was known as Babylon II and another Babylon. But since it historically depended on Babylon and never was a seat of regional power, Borsippa can be ruled out as our Babel as well. Kulab is the name both for a quarter of the city of Babylon and for part of the city of Uruk. Clearly, Uruk is located in the heart of southern Mesopotamia, but undoubtedly the well-known city of Uruk is to be associated with biblical Erech. That's pretty much undisputed. Moreover, the biblical text clearly distinguishes Erech from Babel as early as Genesis 10:10, though both were located in the land of Shinar. Thus, Kulab is not the Babel we're seeking. Kuwara, known later as Kumar, is indeed located in Shumer, southern Mesopotamia, but this less than significant site was established only during the early dynastic II period, which dates to about 2450 BC by anyone's view of chronology, which period was well into historical times, meaning that Kuwara clearly is not Babel either. So that leaves us, I think, two options left. Although there was clear evidence of occupation at Kish during the Ubaid period, which was even before the time of the dispersion from Babel, the earliest recognizable settlements at Kish belong to the proto-literate, following proto-literate technically, Jemdet Nasser period, post-Babel dispersion, when two small villages along a natural or slightly altered watercourse rapidly grew into an urban settlement. Weighing against Kish as an option is that this site was never called Babel or Babylon, but rather it is listed as a candidate since one version of the Sumerian king list records Kish as the first recipient of kingship. Moreover, Kish is located in central Mesopotamia, and so it was not a launching point for either of the two prehistorical expansions from Mesopotamia. So clearly, Kish is no legitimate contender for biblical Babel either. With all of the other Babylons eliminated from contention, Eridu is left as the final option for an alternative site that can be identified positively as the Babel of Genesis 11. Eridu already has been proposed as the proper site for the city of the Tower of Babel, and you can look that up in Roll's legend, The Genesis of Civilization from 1999. So I agree with him that this is the right site for biblical Babel, and let's see if we can prove it. And it's among the cities whose toponym was interchangeable with Babel. Lexical and topographical lists show that Eridu is a name that was given to Babylon proper. So Babylon of later history was called at times Eridu. So there was an interchange in the naming of the city, which shows you that there's an ancient connection in the minds of the Mesopotamian people between the concept of Babel and Eridu. In other words, traditional Babylon was called Eridu. In addition, one version of the Sumerian king list exalts Eridu as the first city to receive kingship from heaven. So ancient Mesopotamian records proclaim or acclaim Eridu as the first place where kingship was given to mankind after the flood. In fact, Eridu's kingdom is listed in the Sumerian king list as having begun before the raging deluge swept in. Eridu is known to be the origin of the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list because of its role in the Sumerian creation epic, in which the god Enki plays a most conspicuous role. He's mentioned with Enlil and Ninhursag as the creator of mankind, and Enki is undisputedly the hero of the deluge story, as mankind was saved through his activity alone. Thus one safely can conclude that the epic hails from Eridu, which is the chief city of Enki. In other words, the god Enki, the god of the freshwater Apsu, that's the underground aquifers of water that bubble up in the right places at the right time in the right conditions. That god is the patron deity of Eridu. So he's connected with this story that undoubtedly originates in the city of Eridu. See how all this connects? Moreover, Eridu's preexistence and preeminence among the cities of the Sumerian king list is not the only example of the interchangeability of Eridu and Babylon. Eridu was named as the city in which Hammurabi was crowned in about the 18th century BC, though undoubtedly this referred to Babylon. In the myth known as the Eridu Genesis, Eridu and Babylon actually refer to the same primeval city. So again, there's this interchangeability throughout the expanded history of Mesopotamian literature. According to the Sumerian king list, Eridu's first king was Alulim, who was called Alorus in the text attributed to Berossus, a Babylonian scribe of the 4th century BC. Yet Berossus did not name Eridu as the city he ruled, but Babylon. A topographical list dating to Nebuchadnezzar I's reign, and that's the 12th century BC, but possibly with earlier antecedents to it, refers to Babylon's religious quarter as Eridu. So once again, we have a huge part of ancient Babylon that's referred to specifically as Eridu. Other texts from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC record Eridu as the city being described, when in fact Babylon is supposed to be the city of reference. During the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the king of Babylon occasionally called himself Lugal-Nunki, meaning king of Eridu in Babylon. And a Achaemenid reference of Darius I to a governor of Babylon, and this would be maybe 5th century BC, who was called governor of Eridu, reveals that this association extended beyond lexical texts and scholarly circles and survived into the administrative term of a later Persian king. So you can see this long history, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of connection between Eridu and Babylon. Well, do we have archaeological evidence that can confirm this possibility? Let's evaluate Eridu as a candidate for Babel. So where is Eridu located? Well, in red here I have the arrow pointing to the red dot where Eridu is positioned. It's very close to the city of Ur, which is where Abram was from. And it's almost directly south from Tel al-Ubaid, which is the type site of the Ubaid expansion, or actually the Ubaid period in Mesopotamian archaeological periodization. And not far from Uruk either, which is to the northwest. So it's part of that package of sites that are extremely important in the earliest periods when large settlements were beginning to develop, and then our first full-blown city, which is Eridu itself. Here's an older drawing, but just to give you a little bit more of a clearer view of where Eridu is compared to some of these other cities. You can see that it's just a little southwest of Ur, and that it's south of Larsa, and then Uruk even further a little bit to the west from Larsa. Well, another important thing to note about Eridu is that in the earliest times, Eridu was located virtually on the banks of the Persian Gulf, just as were Ur and Lagash themselves. So later in time, the shoreline recedes to the point where we have it today. Right here. So this is the shoreline of the Persian Gulf today. But the further you go back in history, this is 1900 BC, this is about 22 to 2500 BC, and then according to conventional dates, not mine, it goes back all the way to the point where Lagash, for example, is right here on the banks of the Persian Gulf. So at this point, the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, so Euphrates here and Tigris here, independently flowed into the Persian Gulf. And it wasn't until much later that they connected themselves and then together flowed into the later Persian Gulf. So this chart offers you a pretty much universally accepted timeline for the periods of Mesopotamian archaeology. You can easily dispute the time periods, but you can't dispute the fact that we have different archaeological periods that are reflected in specific pottery types and tool types and weapon types and architectural styles that are particular to a specific period or sub-period of time. So you can't dispute that. There's no way of, with any credibility, disputing that part of the archaeological record. So the question is just where can we and how can we line up the dates better to work with a young Earth? And I believe that's possible, but it goes beyond the time I have here to try to connect all of that for you and with you. But here you can see number 6, that's the Ubaid period, where the Ubaid expansion was in yellow there to the right of it. And 7 is the Uruk period, so we have the early, middle, and late. And it's during the late Uruk period that we have the late Uruk, or the Uruk expansion, this outward movement of people. Then Jemdet Nasr period is next. That's when Kish was first built, and that's also the time period when writing comes into full bloom. 10 is the Akkadian Empire, and that's when the Sumerian king list was composed. And if you look on my academia.edu website, where I have my published article, a peer-reviewed article on the identity of Nimrod, connecting him with Sargon of Akkad. I think we can connect them with absolute certainty. It's the most detailed study ever undertaken on Nimrod. You can see my argumentation to connect Nimrod with this period of the archaeological periodization of Mesopotamia, specifically the Akkadian dynasty, number 10 here. You can actually download a PDF of this chart from my academia.edu webpage for free. If you've been exposed to academia.edu before, you'll know how easy it is to get. If not, you need to be. This is the real Facebook of the world, folks. Social media is wonderful, but scholarship's where it's at, okay? There's my plug for academia. Well, let's go on. This Sumerian city, that is Eridu, was the seat of worship for Enki, the god of the sweet water Apsu, that springs up from the underground aquifers of the earth. And Eridu long was recognized as Sumer's religious center. And this was known and propagated throughout Mesopotamia's history. This is the religious hub of the ancient-most part of Mesopotamia. Even until the end of the late Uruk period. Not only was Enki the patron god of Eridu, but he also played a key role in the myth of Enmerkar in the lore of Arada. This myth, which probably derives from the Ur-3 period, describes Enki as the god who changed mankind's language. Quote, Enki, the lord of Eridu, changed the languages in their mouths, as many as he had put there, the languages of mankind, which were, how many? 1. So ancient texts themselves from Mesopotamia attest to a time when there's a universal language, one tongue. And then it even says one of their gods is responsible for creating the multi-formed languages that later became universally known as being in existence. So this is an extremely important document. Excavations at Eridu remain quite limited, but by far the most outstanding feature uncovered to date is the long sequence of 18 temples that extend from the Ubaid I phase until the late Uruk period. That's going through a lot of sub-phases of 2 larger periods. The time of the Uruk expansion, and the only viable option for the post-Babel expansion, with most of them dating to the Ubaid period. The earliest building, a small single, that is the earliest temple building, a small single-room structure, Temple 17, was rebuilt into a temple with a niche and 2 platforms that acted as offering tables, which would become a standard feature of later Mesopotamian temples. The dark painted pottery discovered there, called Eridu ware, has been found on only about 10 sites, all in the region around Eridu, Ur, and Uruk. Here is a little bit of iconography, and that, of course, is a fancy word for drawing from the ancient world. You can see Ishtar on your left, with the wings and the horned crown and the implements pointing out from her wings. And below her is Shamash, the sun god, and he is kind of making his appearance as the sun would rise from the east, right? That's the idea. He's like a rising sun there. So most of his body is hidden from view. And then Enki is on our right. And you can see the waters, you could call it flowing into or flowing out of, but certainly the fish are flowing up from the ground into Enki. So iconographically, you're seeing how they connect this god with these freshwater aquifers that exist in the center of the earth. And of course, the flood story, you know that probably the vast majority of water that floods the earth, it comes from where? Below, from the underground aquifers. Makes sense now when you see what was part of ancient thought at the city of Eridu. So Enki's abode was in the Apsu. His emissions watered the earth. Probably as a later trait, he was the god of agricultural success and of wisdom. He aided people in need, and he gave people access to magic. Those are some of the characteristics of this deity. Well, here is the temple that was built to Enki. Built to Enki. So Enki is the local deity, and this is his temple, existing in 18 different phases. So every time, time passed and the city was growing larger, more money was coming in, they needed, more priests or whatever all the reasons were, they decided to expand the temple. So they would level the current temple and rebuild on top of it. You can see Temple 16 in the bottom, later Temple 9 above it. Again, all these dates are conventional. And then at the top, Temple 7, which now you're already seeing the existence of the tripartite temple structure, where you can see to the left, so going from top right to bottom left is one partition, a central courtyard partition, and then third partition parallel to that to its right. So you can see in the beginning there was already a niched temple, or a niched wall where there was probably an altar sitting, and then the deity, Enki himself, in whatever size, made of whatever wood or stone or clay, who knows, that would have been sitting or perched on this altar, and he would have been worshipped according to the prescribed method for the cultic activity that took place at Eridu. So later all of this became more elaborate as time went along. Each of temples 16 through 6 was built immediately above the previous temple, although diagrams often depict them in offset form for the sake of viewing them all sufficiently. The temples of Ubaid 4 phase stood on platforms about 1 meter high. During subsequent phases, these platforms grew, matching the growth of the temple that came with each new phase. At the southwestern end of the central room of the temple was an altar, while at the northeastern end stood a freestanding podium on which, for the final 2 phases of the temple's use, ashes and fish bones were discovered. What should that connect your mind with? How about Enki? These fish bones seem to be the remains of sacrificial offerings, and the type of animal sacrificed represents the patron god of the city perfectly, especially since fish often are drawn in the waters that flow into Enki in iconographic representations like we saw. Eridu is not the only site that featured religious buildings during the Ubaid period, as Uruk, the city of Uruk, and Tepe-Gara had such structures already in the late Ubaid period. Yet none of the structures at any of the other sites from this time remotely compared to the grandeur of Eridu's temple. There was nothing like the temple at Eridu. And that's why in later Mesopotamian history, they have all these recollections of what took place at Eridu and how it was the religious hub, center of all of Mesopotamia. Here's a quick, if you could take all of the temples that are built right on top of each other and expand out as they go and get larger and more elaborate, if you could kind of shift them all this way so you can see what they look like, almost like a cross-section, then this is a good representation of the growth of the temple from its earliest phase until its final phase, when it's an absolutely enormous structure with a large, probably paved courtyard around it. And so the final temple at Uruk was built during the Uruk period, which, what do you know, was the very period of the Uruk expansion that I suggested to you is the right event for the post-Babel dispersion. Here is an older black and white drawing of Eridu's final late Uruk temple. This would be looking at it almost from the front, a little bit to the side. This temple itself was called the Iapsu, the house of subterranean waters. Again, because of that connection with Enki, the god worshipped there, whom they gave credit for all these important events in Mesopotamian history. Well, there's an important book by a man named Safar in the 1980s that was published. It's basically his report, his kind of narrative report on the archaeology that was done at the site of Eridu, which is going to help us, I think, connect the site with biblical Babel and a tower itself. So here's what Safar writes. He says, at the time when the Temple 1 terrace was built, the site on which it was to stand must have sloped sharply to the southwest, for whereas the northwest retaining wall at the ziggurat end was founded hardly 3 meters beneath the level of the terrace pavement, at the western corner we followed its step face down to a depth of nearly 5.15 meters without reaching the bottom. It proved impracticable to descend further simply because the area outside the terrace had at some later period been built up with a filling of loose boulders and gypsum. So there's later work on an earlier construction, whose removal would have required more labor than we had at our disposal. It was this filling, however, which produced most important evidence for the dating of Temple 1. Temple 1 is the final temple, the temple of the late Uruk period. And by the way, after the late Uruk period, the site was abandoned for hundreds of years. Why wasn't there a Temple 0 and a Temple -1 and so forth, built on top of these other ones? It's because the city stopped being the city that it was. The whole city was entirely abandoned. So, we collected from among the boulders of which it was composed an assortment of familiar architectural objects, which were sufficient to convince us that this rubble was derived from the demolition of the proto-literate, that is the Uruk period, temple itself. Most of these objects were mosaic cones. If you were in the last presentation, you know that mosaic cones are diagnostic. They can be attributed to one period only, and that's the late Uruk period. Such as have never, up till now, been found in use in any period later than the Proto-Literate. Other objects found among the filling consisted for the most part of pottery fragments, such as curved spouts and bevel-rimmed bowls. These again are diagnostic ceramic features of the late Uruk period, which could satisfactorily be attributed to the later half of the Uruk period. Specifically the late Uruk, of course, we know, and more specifically attributed to, the late Uruk period. So Temple 1 is the last phase. I have it in red here. The period is the late Uruk period, conventionally dated to about 3400 to 3000 BC. I just want you to look at the chart on the left, because it's giving you the size of temples in the ancient world versus the size of houses. So what you can see as the solid line, which is this one here, this line, that represents the temples over time. And you can see now at the bottom left, 7,000, 6,000 BC, 5,000 BC, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000 BC. Again, all conventional dates. But as you go through those archaeological periods, you see this huge curve where it shoots up like a rocket. And the time of the Uruk expansion is in red going up, and you can see where we are on that curve at the point. Temples are becoming enormous in size, and houses are virtually remaining the same size, more or less, with this wavy curve at the bottom. So religious architecture is going out the roof, and it's right about this very period in history. During the penultimate constructional phase of Eridu's temple, corresponding to Temple 2, a massive extension of the platform was built adjacent to the temple. Notice this. The next to last phase, when you had this already gigantic temple, you now have the building of the construction of, immediately adjacent to it, a platform which actually dwarfs this humongous temple that's larger than any other temple in the ancient world. While excavating at Eridu, archaeologists encountered a ziggurat built atop this platform, which they dated to the much later 3rd dynasty of Ur. That's roughly the 21st century BC, when Abram was alive and around. Which they dated, so Ur-Nammu, he is one of the kings of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, supposedly began the building of this ziggurat, but not until the reign of his grandson, Amar-Sin, was it completed. Now I say supposedly because the ancient world didn't document this well. That wasn't the beginning of the ziggurat that was built on this humongous platform that's adjacent to the final phase of the temple in the late Uruk period. The canonical shape of the ziggurat, with its stages and threefold staircases, suddenly appears with the reign of Ur-Nammu, supposedly, the founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, seemingly without forerunners. This has given rise to suspicions that, in fact, this may be an Akkadian innovation. But there is no conclusive evidence of this so far. Whether Ur-Nammu's construction followed an earlier pattern is unknown at present. In either case, the ziggurat at Ur did not originate at the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, but much earlier. Let's see when it begins. So I have for you a drawing of the site. You can see the topography, you can see the entire tell, the hill that it's built on. You can see the city wall, and in red is the final phase of the temple at its largest, and then dwarfing it is this massive platform. I have it in yellow. You see the disparity in the size there? It's absolutely enormous, especially for the ancient world. And here is a blow-up just to give you a little close perspective of this large tripartite, 3-part temple with the adjacent platform. And again, remember that on that platform is built a ziggurat, and it's completed hundreds of years before, or hundreds of years after the late Uruk period, by one of the kings of the great 3rd dynasty of Ur. They were the empire of their day. So probably, well, I'll come to that in a minute. Here's another look at the temple. Okay, so we have the phases of the temple from the Ubaid period going all the way to the late Uruk period at its largest size. And then here, very lightly, you see, for example, the ramp going up, showing you the size and the position of this massive building that was constructed adjacent to the temple, and again, completed during the reign of Amar-Sin in the 3rd dynasty of Ur. This is a drawing of the ziggurat, just to give you a better feel for one of the earlier ziggurats that we know what the shape would have been like. So this is the ziggurat at Ur, the city of Ur, that would probably be about the same as what we would expect to the finished product of the ziggurat that was built on the platform at Eridu. And here is some of the original, a photo of some of the original archaeologists who were involved in the dig there and examining the site, examining this ziggurat that was completed under Amar-Sin. So here's a question. Despite the presence of the later ziggurat, could there have been a much earlier ziggurat standing adjacent to the temple of Enki, perhaps right in the spot where the Ur III era ziggurat of Amar-Sin was built in 2024? Answer, and I'm quoting Safar here, at the ziggurat end of the Temple 1 terrace, a considerable effort was made to investigate the already existing structure against which it had been built. It appeared to consist of a rough retaining wall supporting a filling of mud brick and sand. Some 25 meters to the northwest, we encountered the broadly rounded corner of a platform face or retaining wall on approximately the same alignment as the later ziggurat. And since its well-laid stonework was strengthened every few courses with a thick layer of bitumen, which of course we read about in the account of Genesis 11, don't we? In exactly the same manner as the Temple 1 terrace. So Temple 1, late Uruk period. He's now finding architectural style that equals that here at the area of the platform. We assumed it to be contemporary. The northwestern face of this structure was again picked up at 2 points beneath the denuded remains of the ziggurat, and its northern corner located on a line with the northeastern face of the latter. We therefore appear to have been right in thinking that the platform of our proto-literate, that is late Uruk, another equally important building subsequently displaced by the ziggurat of Amar-Sin during the third dynasty of Ur. So he's saying we found reasons to connect the two to the same period in time, the temple and the platform. All effort to discover actual traces of the building underneath the later ziggurat failed, mostly due to the toughness of the masonry of the Ur III builders. In other words, it was just too foreboding of a task to try to bore through this ziggurat and get, to the heart of it through attempts to go right through this solid material. Therefore, until the ziggurat of Amar-Sin is penetrated, the later Uruk building that's underneath it will remain sealed from modern eyes. Well, traversing the northeastern side of the ziggurat is a wall of an earlier structure that was built with Rimkin bricks. That's diagnostic of the late Uruk period, which were used to make all of the late Uruk building in the Eana district at Uruk and are diagnostic for the late Uruk period. In this vicinity, scattered clay mosaic stone cones were found, which are also diagnostic for the late Uruk. Such clay or stone mosaic cones were found not only at southern Mesopotamian sites, but also faraway sites in the periphery where the southern Mesopotamian residents had relocated during the Uruk expansion. And in the last presentation, we saw Habuba Kabira, way off in Syria, ancient Syria, as part of this expansion of people where they're bringing with them all these characteristic features of the southern Mesopotamian culture. As for Eridu's Temple 1, the Bible states not only that he who is scattered Babel's inhabitants over the surface of the whole land, or earth, either way, but that they stopped building the city. Given that the building of the tower was a grand project intended to give a name to the builders, clearly the focus was on the construction of monumental architecture. One would expect that there would be clear evidence of the cessation of construction on the monumental architecture at Babel, since they stopped building when the people's languages were confused. One of the most extraordinary features of the terrace structure associated with Temple 1 was the immensely long time during which it must have remained standing. It was repaved occasionally over hundreds and hundreds of years, with broken bricks bearing the names of rulers including Amar-Sin and a king of Larsa from the 2nd millennium BC. At first glance, the excavators were inclined to assign a late date to the temple, but eventually the evidence supporting its dating to the late Uruk period became overwhelming. So what happened is a structure was built during the late Uruk period. The foundation was laid, the platform was there. They undoubtedly began the building of this building on it, and construction ended at the same time that the temple was abandoned, and the entire site was abandoned, just out of the clear blue sky. And this abandoning of the city demonstrates that that we probably have a reason why we have a connection to the cessation of this constructing of the temple or of the ziggurat that was built on the platform. Now think about it. If the third dynasty of Ur, centered at Ur, which is very close to Eridu, became the greatest city in the world of its time, in Abraham's day. And they had a neighboring city, the ancient city of Eridu, that had this dilapidated, never completed building. Then probably it would have been a reproach against the powerful third dynasty of Ur to have such a close-by city with a terrible, eyesore so close to them. And the king, of course, he would have had slaves at his disposal, money at his disposal, building materials. So undoubtedly he would have commissioned his subjects or his slaves, whatever, to complete the construction of this ziggurat so that it's not such an eyesore so close to the center of his empire. See how that works? Considering the evidence of the 18 phases of Eridu's temple, the appearance is given that each successive temple was leveled, rebuilt, and so forth. Yet if all of the 17 earlier phases of the temple were leveled, followed by the construction of a newer and grander version, why did this process stop abruptly with Temple 1 of the later Ur period? Moreover, Temple 1 clearly remained in place for approximately 1,000 years, just sitting there, after its construction and renovation after a long period of abandonment. The fact that the temple was refurbished as late as 1750 BC demonstrates the prestigious status that Eridu's final temple held in the minds of all conquerors who possessed Eridu at one time or another. Okay, why don't we just go ahead and stop there? Thank you.